Infatti, adesso sì, anche troppo. Cominciamo con...
Good afternoon. We can start our conference. Thank you for being here in huge numbers. I'm very pleased to introduce to you this conference. We will listen to Professor Juan DOLADO. He is a Spanish professor. He teaches at the Juan Carlos III University in Madrid and also at the European Institute in Fiesole, Florence. He specialized in labor economy and specifically in econometric theories. And he is specifically an expert of one of the topics which are under the focus of attention also here at the festival, that is migration, immigration, and possible benefits deriving from migration. So I'm very pleased to be here tonight with you to listen to Professor DOLADO, because he will provide us with very interesting data and evidence. I have been working for some years now as a journalist in both Italy and Spain, and so I have my own picture of the situation in the two countries. In 2007, I went to El País to work for El País in Spain, and in those days, I witnessed the beginning of a trial against terrorists of the 2004 March terror attack, which caused 193 casualties, which is which makes it the worst terror attack so far in Europe. It was a jihadist terror attack. At the time, we did not have the Islamic State. Al-Qaeda, though, was there. And the terror attack of the time was very similar to what we then saw in Paris and Brussels. It was violence against commuters, against people moving towards the center of the capital and of Spain as a whole. Because you see, Madrid is the center of Spain and at the center of Spain. So due to the high number of victims and due to the devastating effects produced by the terror attack, people talked a lot about it, and that also had an influence on the voting outcome, because elections were held after a few days. So that was the case then. And I was there when the trial started after 3 years. I therefore had the chance to focus on all the details and detailed information. And specifically what caught my attention was the fact that these terrorists had planned ferociously the attack. I thought that people would react in a xenophobic way and in a violent way, but actually it was not so. People were talking about personal and individual responsibilities. The newspapers talked about individuals giving name, surname, and address and age. So newspapers talked about individuals who had perpetrated the crime, and they did not take on a racist attitude. That was the attitude of the media, and actually people followed suit, or perhaps it was the other way around, but also politicians voiced the very same type of attitude, in that elections, as I told you, were held after a few days, but nobody thought of exploiting that situation and talk against Islam. So that was the case also in 2007 when the trial started. So actually, this is, as I said, was the general attitude, and this is something that I noticed in the streets of Madrid, in the cafes of Madrid. I was moving to Madrid at the time, and I was also commuting in a way between Italy, Bologna specifically, and Madrid in Spain. Bologna actually is certainly not famous in Italy for its extreme right-wing attitude, rather the opposite. At the time, though, Roberto Calderoli, a parliament member of Lega Nord, was organizing the Maiale Day, the Pig Day, in Bologna. And what he was organizing was a walk with his pig in the place where the administration of Bologna had planned to build a mosque. So there was a sharp contrast between the situation in Italy and the triviality of what was happening in Italy on the one hand and what was going on in Spain. That was really food for thought for me. And then I saw that also in the following years, and that was evidenced also during the economic crisis. Spain had a booming economy. They were needing workers and labor coming also from other countries. It was my case too. And people could have decent jobs. They could choose where to go and live in the city. And they also could afford purchasing property and having a family. So it was a good time for Spain, economically speaking, and also psychologically speaking, if I may add so, because in those years people were gaining hold of the present time. They were owners of their own present time after a long period, decades before, of course, of dictatorship in Spain. So actually it was a joyful period, but then something went wrong. In 2008, the economic crisis was devastating in Spain. Unemployment rate was huge, and Professor DOLADO will certainly comment upon that. There were huge curbs in terms of the wages of civil servants, but also welfare and education policies and several other things. If you happen to know people who live in Spain, you certainly know what I'm talking about. But even within and in the period of the economic crisis, Spain was different from other countries. In several countries, due to the crisis, populism boomed and flourished, taking on a xenophobic attitude, but Spain did not do that. New York Times, just a few days ago, published an article, and it was full of tables, by the way, but the point is that the article was about the right-wing movements in Europe, and measurement of the situation in several countries were given, and different colors were given to extreme right-wing parties and right-wing parties and so on and so forth. All countries had that type of experience, but not Spain. In Spain, unemployment is still very high, and there are huge economic issues and problems, but that is not accompanied by the trends I told you. And that goes also for an attitude towards migration. In Spain, actually, the opposite is true, in that unemployment is very high, but concern about migration is extremely low. The barometer, what we call the barometer about concerns of people, was published, and 78% of Spaniards said that they are worried in relation to possible unemployment or being unemployed, and then corruption was an issue, but only 3% of people said migration is a problem. And you see, you might object that it is due to the fact that there are just two political parties in Spain, but it is not so. New parties have emerged. Podemos is one of them, and so they do have a populist nuance to them, because they exploit the discontent of people, the malaise which is present in the society of Spain. So populism is present, but this populism never actually translates into outright racism. On the 26th of June, there are general elections in Spain, and the electoral campaign is absolutely free of these anti-migration arguments and opinions and ideas, which often we hear and listen to in Italy. We often hear people say in Italy that migrants come here and steal our own jobs and our places in kindergartens and in schools. This is not happening in Spain. It has not happened so far in Spain, and this is what I wanted to tell you before giving the floor to Professor DOLADO.
Grazie mille, Lucia. It's a great pleasure being here, so thanks to the organizers and thanks to all of you to have shown up at this time of the evening. So I must confess I didn't choose the topic of this talk. When one of the organizers, Tito Boeri, called me up to see whether I would like to give a talk, he suggested the topic. And he thought exactly, he used the same words that Lucia was using. What's going on in Spain, that immigration is not being seen as a problem, as it's often the case in the rest of Europe, even when you are undergoing a really bad situation. So I thought it was a provoking theme, and what I want to do in the remaining part of this talk is just to share with you some sort of brainstorming about what I think could be the explanation and to what extent it can be extended to other cases and whether we can draw useful lessons, especially for the current circumstances that Europe is undergoing. Okay, so the first thing, just to remark, to highlight, is that Spain is not part of the European swing to the extreme right. Here you have a graph where you can, using Gallup and other sources of political polls, of electoral polls, you can see the rise in opinion polls from January 2013 to May 2016 of different far-right parties in different parts of Europe. So starting from Poland, where of course the PIS is part of the current government, to going to Austria, where of course a couple of weekends ago they almost had to choose a far-right president, to Switzerland, to Denmark, to Sweden, and of course France, Netherlands. Well, the only lesson to be drawn from this graph is that Spain is not there, okay? No political party, no major political party in Spain, neither in the previous general elections that took place last December, nor in the forthcoming general elections will take place in June, after the lack of agreement to form a coalition, exhibits any xenophobic attitudes or exhibits any anti-migration policies in the party agendas. Again, this is just a graph taken from The Economist, where you can see the trend in the advance of the far right in Europe, and as I said, which are part of coalition governments or the sole party in the government in some of these countries. Just to give you an idea of what's the importance of anti-migration or far-right parties in Spain, here you have the list of the 8 parties which have anti-migration statements in their agendas. In the 2015 general elections last December, in the first row, there are 350 seats in the Spanish Parliament, and you have the number of seats there, which is of course 0, and in the second column you have the share of votes. So basically there is no far right, there is no anti-migration. This is out of the Spanish scenario. In the recent history of democratic elections in Spain, since 1987, when democracy was restored, only one party with anti-migration views won a seat, and that was a single seat from 1979 to 1982, a party called Fuerza Nueva, which was a party formed by former Franco's allies. And yet, despite not having far-right parties, Spain, at the beginning of the 21st century, became the second country of destination in the OECD in terms of immigration inflows. So this is a graph where you have the percentage of immigrants in OECD countries, so OECD as country of destination, from all over the world. And of course, the main country of destination, this doesn't seem to work. The first country of destination is obviously the United States, but the second country of destination above Australia, Canada, United Kingdom, etc., is Spain. Of course, follow a little bit closely by Italy. So this is a representative year. In 2004, about 10% of all immigrants arriving to the OECD went to Spain. Okay? So this, of course, implies that the intensity of the migration influx to Spain, the arrival of migrants in Spain, is comparable to historical episodes, like, for instance, what happened in Greece after the end of the Turkish-Greek War at the beginning of the 20s, where 1 million Turkish Greeks arrived to Greece, whose population at that time was 5 million. So that was an increase, all of a sudden an increase in the population of almost 20%. Or the famous Miami boat lifts coming from Cuba, the so-called Marielitos, a fleet of boats which arrived, 150,000 Cubans arriving to the shores of Miami, all of a sudden in 1980, or more recently, the arriving of Jewish Russians to Israel in 1990 after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which meant an increase in the population of almost 10%. So here you have the immigrant shares in selected European countries, including Italy. And what you can see is, of course, there is an upward trend, except perhaps in France. In the rest of the countries, you see an upward trend in the share of immigrants, but the steepness of the increase in Spain doesn't have any other, it's much larger than elsewhere, including the UK. So it is this huge arrival of migrants which led to a large stock of foreign-born population in a very short period of time, over 10 years, between 2000 and 2010. So the pink line in Spain, of course, the starting point was less than 1 million foreign-born people living in Spain, and in a few years, in less than a decade, it reached close to 5.5 million. So 4.5 million arrivals over that period, a very short period of 10 years. So basically almost 500,000 per year. It's getting close to Germany. Of course, doesn't reach Germany, which is a much larger country, and the number of foreign-borns is much larger, but it's getting close. And you can see as time goes by and we approach the period of the Great Recession and its aftermath, that the number of migrants in Spain has remained high. Okay, so that's something to take into account. Well, Lucia was mentioning this. When you look at the natives' attitudes toward migration, what you see, according, for instance, to the European Social Survey, this is 2002 to 2012, is that Spain has one of the largest approval rates. In fact, up to 2008, the beginning of the Great Recession, it was the largest in Europe. And even afterwards, it's only second to some of the northern Scandinavian countries. So this happened even after one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in Europe that Lucia was also mentioning. I didn't want to put any photograph to respect, of course, the dignity of the families who suffered there, but there were bombings in 4 railway stations in Madrid, and almost 200 people killed. And on March 11, 2004, and about 2,000 people injured. The attacks were claimed by an Al-Qaeda cell, and And that was really a big shock in terms of the threat of Islamic terrorism and the possibility of mixing this up with Muslim immigrants in Spain, and nothing happened, okay? So this is the graph that Lucia was mentioning before. Even after when you enter the recession period after 2008, if you use, for instance, the latest Eurobarometer, if you look at the proportion of people who respond positive towards immigration, the darker red ones are the countries in which this response is lower. So we know Italy is, of course, among them, France, the Czech Republic, Hungary, etc. But Spain and Portugal are among those countries in which the proportion of people against immigration is below 50%. The current figure in favor is about around 58%, and this is 2016. So really not at the peak of economic growth that we saw in the previous decade. So basically, this is another graph which illustrates the so-called Spanish exception against the European Social Survey, and on the horizontal axis you have people have to classify the economic situation on a range of values from 0, which is very bad, to 10, which is good. And here you have to, again, value the contribution of immigrants to the economy from 0 to 10. And what you see is, of course, most people in Spain, which is there, value the economic situation. This is 2012. This is just at the trough of the recession as very bad in Spain, but it's one of the countries where the opinion in favor of migrants is larger. Okay, so this is what I come to label the Spanish exception in that respect. So for the rest of the talk, I'll talk briefly. I'll develop briefly what were the origins of this immigration boom, which were the turning points in this immigration process. What happened when Spain moved from a big boom? In Spain, it used to be called the Belle Époque, the period from 2000 to 2010, to the period of darkness. No? And then at the end of the day, I'll give you this sort of open brainstorming about my opinion, which of course I'm happy to discuss at length further when the questions arrive, on what could be the potential explanation for this Spanish exception. Okay, so whenever there is somebody moves, whenever there is immigration or immigration, depending on the viewpoint of the country of origin or the country of destination, there is what economists call a push and a pull effect. So the push effect is something is not going well in your country of origin, and therefore you look at an exit, you look a way out of that. The pull effect is something is going well in the country of destination, and therefore you feel attracted. Okay, and here, as in many other cases, there have been strong push and pull effects. So, as I'll develop later on, I'll extend later on, Spain, with Italy, is one of the countries with the lowest fertility rates in the world. On the other hand, it's one of the countries as well, within the olive belt, the Mediterranean area, which has a higher life expectancy. So it's a society which is progressively aging. So of course this puts a lot of pressure on the pension system. Okay? So that was the situation to start with. Then both Italy, Spain, and many other countries, when they accessed the euro, especially the southern Mediterranean countries, were countries which had middle to high inflation. But all of a sudden, they were assimilated by the beauty of financial markets to Germany. So whereas having high inflation, if you remember the mortgage rates you were paying in the mid-90s, those were 2 digits. And all of a sudden, we all became Germans, okay? So the nominal interest rate fell down dramatically to 3-4%, so you figure in the next slide, whereas inflation stayed relatively higher. So that meant that the real interest rate difference between the nominal interest rate and inflation fell down a lot. So it was very cheap to take loans and invest. So typically low real interest rate imply an investment boom. So where did this investment go? Well, Spain and Italy as well, as I'll come about in a second, have labor markets which are heavily dualized. So there is a important share of precarious jobs, the so-called temporary contracts, fixed-term contracts, and then highly protected jobs. So if you have an investment boom in these countries, it cannot go unlike, for instance, what happened in Finland or what happened in some other of the Scandinavian countries. It cannot go into high-return, high-risk sectors. So think of computing sectors, IT sectors like Nokia in Finland, etc. Why? Because these are high-return, potentially high-return sectors, but also entail a lot of risk. So if typically to be successful, you need several failures before. So you have to pay a fortune as compensation, severance pay, as dismissal compensations to your worker. The first time you fail, you never stand up. So this means that in all these countries, particularly in Spain, it was preferable to invest in mature sectors where you could use these cheap temporary contracts because it was basically seasonal sectors like tourism, etc., and in particular construction sectors. Okay, so all this investment in countries like Spain went into real estate and service-based sectors because of the institutions in the labor market, apart from the particular geographical location, etc. So there was a large increase in the demand for less skilled labor. On the other hand, from the viewpoint of the countries of origin, of course we know that it was a demographic boom in less developed countries, and in particular at the beginning of the 2000s, there were two very serious financial crises in Latin America, which I label these countries as LATAM, so particularly in Argentina. So given this setup, well, this is just what I was telling you about interest rates. There you have the interest rate, the mortgage interest rates you were paying. Sorry, the mortgage interest rates you were paying before the process of access to the euro, and once we all became Germans and got assimilated. Okay, of course, later on there have been some divergence in the spreads, but compared to the previous differences, these are really minor. Okay. So this is the origin of the investment boom in most of these countries. So as I said before, Spain, which is here, is the land of temporary contracts. It's a highly dual labor market, as it's also the case of Italy, and it was the case of Portugal, it was the case of Greece. So this means that whenever you have a dual labor market, you have like two populations living in the same country. So one population, those under temporary contracts, live in Italy or in Spain, but in fact they are hired in Hong Kong, whereas the other part of the population and the highly protected contracts live like in North Korea or in the old Soviet Union. Okay, so and they both coexist at the same time. So what's the property of these labor markets? The property of these labor markets is that those who live in Hong Kong, under inverted commas, are very easily hired, but also they lose their job very, very easily, because these are typically short-term contracts which are not renewed, so people go into unemployment, they find another short-term contract, and so on and so forth. But these are very, very, very appropriate contracts to hire low-skilled workers in these low-value added sectors that I was mentioning before. So So, of course, when you have a labor market arrangement like that, uncertainty is a big feature. So if you move from one temporary contract to unemployment to another temporary contract and so on and so forth, you cannot plan a family, you cannot plan your life, etc., etc. So first, this affects labor mobility, so people don't move. I don't want to move from Ragusa to Milan if I only get a contract for 4 months. And second, it affects also the fertility. So as you can see, the origin of these dual labor markets in Spain was in the early 80s, and as you can see, there was a collapse. There was a collapse in fertility rates starting from the moment the labor market became so dualized. Here you cannot see it, but these are fertility rates in the world, and we are only beaten by Italy as the lowest, the country with the lowest fertility rate in the world. So where am I going with all these preambles? Well, what I'm going is the following. Here you have historical, the Spanish population growth from a historical perspective, starting from the mid-19th century to just basically before the Great Recession. So remember, this is the period you can see a huge fall in population growth, and this is the period where duality took place in the labor market. So suppose that you have someone being born in 1980 or mid-90s. But this baby at this time will enter the labor market basically after completing compulsory education, will be by age 16. So they will enter the labor market around here, okay? But there were very few of them because the fertility rates were extremely low at the time when demand for unskilled labor was very large, okay? So, of course, the solution Spanish employers found for this shortage of demand in these low value-added sectors was to bring the gates to immigration. Okay? So that's the way to explain it. So, of course, immigration fill the age gap. Here you have it's called the pyramid of the Spanish population, which is the solid line. Of course, you can see this looks more like a cube rather than a pyramid. So meaning that, of course, population is aging at that time. Whereas when you look at this is the profile of the Spanish population. Whereas, of course, migrants are much younger. So you can see that the biggest proportion of migrants was precisely around 30 or even younger. So filling up the shortage of labor demand in Spain. So, given the combination of this huge increase in demand for labor and for unskilled labor, and the sort of financial crisis that Latin American countries were undergoing precisely at that period, what it meant is that the large fraction, here you have the distribution by country of origin, the large fraction of migrants arriving between the first decade of the 21st century were mostly Latin Americans. So basically were Latin Americans and then people from some of the eastern countries, and a lesser amount, like 20% as compared to 44% coming from Northern Africa. So there was a clear, I remember at the time, there was a very clear distinction between the type of migrants that were arriving from both continents. So you have the Africans were mostly men from Morocco, from some of the sub-Saharan area. They were mostly men who went to work in the construction sector. Whereas from Latin America, it was basically women, okay, who were working in the housekeeping sector. So they were looking after our kids, they were looking after our elderly. And that, as I will point out in a second, is part of why Spaniards take these sort of migrants with gratefulness, right? Because they provided ways for us to work more hours, for increases in female labor force participation, etc. So you won't see that, but this is the distribution by occupations of migrants, personal services and protective service. So these were the people working in the housekeeping and so on. 26% of immigrant women were working in that sector, whereas this is women, this is men. Men were mostly working in laborers in mining, construction, etc., whereas women specialized mostly, as I said, in housekeeping. Also, because of the cultural affinity of having so many people coming from Latin America, sales and elementary services operations were basically 50% of women were working in catering, hotels, etc., in sales. And of course, because they could speak Spanish, and furthermore, they were particularly good in terms of communicational skills. The best Spanish, for instance, in the world is not spoken in Spain, it's spoken in Colombia. Okay, so we had plenty of Colombians serving our coffees, etc., in a very, very nice way. So, of course, this led to huge changes, as I mentioned before, in sectoral composition. So, for instance, here you have the share of the construction sector, the yellow line, by 2007, reached almost 14% of GDP, which is extremely large by any accounts in any other country, except perhaps Ireland. Whereas, of course, with the boom, with the bust that we will discuss later on, this has gone down to almost 6%. So it has fallen down around 8 percentage points. So there are studies looking at how much, of course, migrants arrived there. They were working in the construction sector, but they were also searching for places to live. So they were the recipients of many of the mortgages. So basically, they accounted for almost half of the new housing units that were built up over that period. Okay, that's what the evidence says. So in this respect, like supply creates some demand. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why at that stage it was not very easy to detect that there was going to be a bubble, because there was an increase in demand of these new cohorts of people entering the country of housing units. The same could be said about the increase in house price growth. This yellow line is the increase over the period between the early 90s and nowadays, and the end of the bubble, which was in 2009, and nowadays. And basically, there have been empirical papers looking at how much of the increase in the bubble was due to this higher demand of migrants, and basically about 1/4 of house price growth is due to the higher demand by migrants. It also had some effect on inequality, which is, of course, another of the big themes nowadays. So here you have a graph where you can see the patterns followed by the unemployment rate, which is the dashed line. So this is the unemployment rate in Spain. I'll comment a little bit further on. And this is the earnings dispersion. So it's the difference between the earnings of the 90th percentile and the 10th percentile. So the larger it is, the more unequal is the earnings distribution. So you could see that during the period in which migrants were arriving, unemployment not only fell, but inequality also fell a lot. Why? Because all these people working in the low value-added sectors, in the booming construction sector, etc., they were getting high wages. So basically inequality fell down from the bottom. It was the less skilled workers that were earning much more than the low-skilled workers in relative terms, okay? So the moment the bubble burst, and as I said, we'll comment about that in the next slides, inequality immediately surged, okay? So what was the turning point in all this process? Were these migrants arriving smoothly to the country? Well, the turning point, in my view, was in 2005, there was a huge regularization process. So the typical migration policy between 2005 was one where you had stringent quotas, which were not really enforced. So basically, every year you could have like 30,000 people receiving working permits, but in reality there were like 300,000 arriving. And I can discuss a little bit how was this happening. Part of it was probably due to the lack of coordination of the Schengen group. I mean, some of these migrants, especially Latin Americans, seem to be arriving through Amsterdam and some other airports where the corresponding police, the Dutch police, knew that they were speaking Spanish-speaking, and therefore they would not remain in the country, and therefore they let them in. So by 2004, there were like 1 million irregular migrants in Spain. So what did the government at the time, was a socialist government, do? Well, they decided, given that the pension system was under stress and that these people were working already there, why don't we regularize them, give them working permits, insofar as they can prove that they had been entered the country before a given date and that they had been working before the previous 6 months. And then there were 700,000 applications and about 600,000 working permits were awarded. So you may see, well, this may have caused a huge call effect. Well, that was not the case. And in the views of the Spanish population, these migrants were somewhat helping to support the pension system. All of a sudden, they were paying social security contributions. They were young. Most of them will not stay in Spain because there is return migration. They will not get their pension, so there is a net benefit for natives. So that was really, in the sociological surveys, etc., that was part of the explanation why Spaniards were so much in favor at that stage. And that, of course, echoes some of the themes that could rise nowadays with the new wave of migration, of course, coming from, not from closer countries like Latin America and Spain, but coming from Syria, Afghanistan, etc., etc. So, well, this is just a figure of people newly registered in the social security system. This graph has the name of the prime ministers at the time. So you had Aznar, who was the leader of the Conservative Party until 2004. Zapatero, who was the leader of the president, the prime minister and the Socialist Party, and the current prime minister, Rajoy. So you could see this is the period of the amnesty, the regularization, and there was a huge increase in the number of newly registered, newly foreign registered people in the Social Security, which later on, of course, has sort of vanished, but not to the extent of the stringent immigration policy of the early 2000s. So, of course, as I mentioned before, this has postponed the Spanish population aging. So here you have a graph where you have the weight, this is age in the horizontal axis, and you have the weight in the population of someone age 14 or someone age 64, etc., etc. Well, you can see is that the peak of the peak of the Spanish population weight is before the peak of the population weight in countries which are aging faster, like it could be France or Germany, etc. So this was, of course, the effect of this almost 5 million new Spaniards, which were much younger than those who were living there. So from boom to crisis, well, let me just give you some numbers. This is the unemployment rate and the labor force participation, 2000, 2007, and the latest figures, 16. Well, of course, the first striking things is, of course, labor force participation by men and women. This is the overall figure. It's much higher than among natives. Why? Because migrants are economic migrants. They are coming to work in the country, so they are looking desperately for a job. Of course, given that the composition of employment, that they were mostly employed in low value added, and especially in the construction sector, when you look at the unemployment rate, they almost double the natives' unemployment rate. Nowadays, the unemployment rate among migrants is almost 35%, whereas among natives is about 20%. Okay? Whereas in 2007, the difference was much smaller. So the brunt of the adjustment in Spain, of the employment adjustment, has fallen on migrants. But it has fallen on migrants because they were overrepresented in these cheap temporary contracts that you can terminate basically at no cost. Okay? So as I will argue later on, this may be one of the explanations of why immigration hasn't seen as a problem in Spain, because they were not competing directly with Spaniards. They were segregated in the labor market, or segregated to a large extent. So, of course, when you look at the unemployment rate in Spain, for those of you who are not familiar, it exhibits a shape that we call bulimic. It has a bulimic labor market. So because of this duality in the labor market, it's able to create millions of jobs during expansions. So think of in the mid-90s, Spain had an unemployment rate of 22%, which fell down to almost Germany's level, 6-7%, just before the onset of the Great Recession, and now it goes back. So this is like bulimia. You absorb a lot and then you throw it away, okay? And this is just because of this dual labor market structure. So what has happened to, this is just to remark once more what I was telling you before. What has been the view of migration during this bust period, this recession period? Well, remember, we are in a single currency area. Whenever we suffer a bad shock, what economic tests would tell you is that before we could use devaluations. Now we cannot devalue because there is no alternative currency to devalue. So we have to cut our costs directly, not through the exchange rate. So this is called the internal devaluation. So the way to adjust is if there is excess unemployment, then of course these people look jobs elsewhere. And in a country with so many migrants as it was Spain, this was the part of the population that were ready to move elsewhere. Of course, the Spaniards were much less mobile than these migrants. So when the recession started, the ones who really started to leave the country were these migrants, okay, rather than the Spaniards. So the Spaniards saw the migrants as a valve of escape, of avoiding the pain of the recession. So in terms of unit labor costs, the alternative way of adjusting to a negative shock, migrants were also very influential. First of all, one of the main reasons for achieving such a reduction in unemployment before the Great Recession was that the migrants introduced huge flexibility in the labor market by adjusting their wages. And this is not just slavery. I mean, remember, many of these people were sending half or 1/3 of their salaries abroad as remittances. So suppose, I don't know, I'll give you an example. My mother, who is very elderly, looks after a Bolivian lady. So this Bolivian lady has her family in Cochabamba. She's sending like 1/3 of what she's getting paid. The purchasing power is much, much higher in Bolivia than in Madrid. So of course she's ready to work. Of course there is collective bargaining on how much she would pay, so everything is completely legal, but she's ready to work for a lower wage than a native whose expenditures are completely inside the country. So, just to cut a long story short, during the recession, Spaniards saw migrants as helping them to get abroad. Of course, this may be a cynical view, because some of these migrants were leaving and they were cutting their wages even longer than, more than the Spaniards. So you look at the foreign population changes at the beginning of the end of the previous century. There were 40 million Spaniards, and the predictions for the following 20 years was that the Spanish population, at the pace of aging that we were observing, would reach about 36 million. Well, by 2010, 2012, the Spanish population had reached 47 million. So, of course, there has been adjustment, and you can see that it has fallen by about 600, and among migrants, it has fallen by about 1 million. But the pillars of the working population, especially of the pension system, are much stronger than they were before that. So, as I said, I will end the talk with speculations about this special feature of migration in Spain, and especially why there is this lack of anti-migration feelings. Some of the ideas I want to share with you have already been discussed throughout the talk, but let me just throw some new ones to you. Well, as I mentioned when I was showing you some of the graphs about the native sentiments toward migration, it's not only Spain, which has a rather favorable view, but also Portugal. So what Spain and Portugal have in common is that they suffer very long military dictatorships, which led to autarchies and isolation. Of course, this also led to huge outflows of Spaniards and Portuguese moving abroad on exile, and political exile, etc., etc. So during the 30s to the 70s, about 2.5 million Spaniards left the country to work in Germany, to work in France and Switzerland. Also, they moved to Latin America. So, in fact, most of them moved, two-thirds moved to Latin America. So there was a favorable attitude. Having been a secluded society, having been an autarky for so long, there was a very favorable attitude toward openness, okay? And some sort of reciprocity as well. On the other hand, after 40 years of military dictatorship, most extreme right parties were repudiated. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why there are no Spanish parties, far-right parties. They became completely erased from the political scene after the late 70s. Of course, a key issue is that immigrants arrive during an upturn. They arrive during a growth period, but they help consolidating this long-lasting boom. Of course, the end of the Belle Epoque was sad with the burst of the housing bubble, etc. But the Spanish population appreciated their contribution to this long-lasting prosperity period. Well, as I mentioned before, a large fraction came from Latin America. So, of course, this eases cultural affinity and facilitates assimilation. Of course, this is something which is not going to be the case with the current pressure from migrants who do not speak the countries of destination languages. So I think the only lesson to be drawn from here is that we should invest a lot in this newer generation of migrants learning our languages fast, because that facilitates assimilation a lot. As I said before, a large fraction work in the home service sector. That increased female labor force participation, which is low, as in most of the southern countries, quite a lot, because all of a sudden college-educated women could leave their kids, could leave their parents, elderly parents, with people who are ready to work for a reasonable salary, which were not available before. On the other hand, as I mentioned, the 2005 large amnesty process, almost 600,000 new working permits for those working irregularly, was seen by natives as a remedy for the pension system sustainability, and it was. I mean, it delayed the system getting into a deficit by about 5 years. That's the computation. The Spanish welfare system is not particularly redistributive. So the transfers to the low income people are not particularly generous. And of course, migrants were overrepresented in that among the low paid. So they were not perceived as a fiscal drag. So this typical complaint of crowding out of the health system, etc., didn't happen because before the arrival of migrants, even the low-income Spanish people were not receiving that much. The dual labor market has been, I think, very instrumental, and I'm being cynical in this respect, in decreasing direct competition between natives and migrants. Remember, 50% of migrants work under temporary contracts, whereas the figure for natives is much lower, so they don't compete directly. So that's something that may also facilitate this appreciation of foreign workers. Of course, related to the current population migration pressure, well, the dysfunctionality of the Spanish labor market with this big dualism makes Spain a very non-attractive destination for refugees. So the refugees crisis is completely unknown in Spain. I think so far we have admitted like 200 migrants, and the basic reason, even if the quota that it was assigned to us is much larger, is nobody wanted to come to Spain. And finally, I think this is an issue which may also explain some of the lack of tension and the favorable impact of migrants, is that being such a recent phenomenon, the share of second-generation migrants in Spain is still fairly low. And we know that most of the tensions come from the lack of assimilation, the lack of integration of second-generation migrants. So especially there are some signs of worrying processes in the education and even in the residential segregation in cities. So migrants live in some parts, natives live in some others. And within the education system, you could see also some pressure in particular public schools, etc., etc. So that's the worrisome problem. But a combination of all these features is what has made Spain so far to benefit quite a bit from immigration and not see immigrants as foes, but as collaborators. Thanks a lot.
Quindi finalmente abbiamo dato una buona notizia.
Well, good news at last. Well, I have a variety of questions to ask, but of course you are supposed to speak first. It's 7, we have a quarter of an hour for Q&A session, and I'm going to ask the first question, and then we'll be collecting questions from you as well. I mean, you said that this wonderful antidote in Spain is the result of many factors, many phenomena, both economic ones and cultural ones that derive from Spanish history. But, you know, vaccines are, well, you have to re-inoculate a vaccine. I mean, they don't last forever. For how long would you expect this situation to last? And then, is that, in your opinion, repeatable in other countries? Well, Italy is not that different from Spain.
My view, you may have noticed that Spain is now under a recovery process. So Spain is growing, not under very solid grounds, but is now one of the fastest growing economies in Europe. So nothing has changed basically in the labor market. So all this dualism is still in place. So I would expect that the same process that dragging immigrants will operate now, because the investment is going to go in the same sectors as before. Yeah, that's construction is, of course, after falling dramatically, is starting to pick up. So, and the latest figures, as far as I know, is that the outflows have slowed down, and the inflows have slightly increased. But in a period of 10 years, I see, remember, we are, despite the push given by migrants to the age structure of the population, we are aging at a high speed, so we will need thousands of migrants.
La signora voleva. Poi vediamo se è replicabile poi in Italia.
Sì, buonasera. Dunque, alla luce...
Good evening. After what you said about Spanish immigration, I like to draw a parallel with Italian immigration. The Italian migration is just as recent as the Spanish one. I mean, it started in the 80s and 90s, because before that it was very seldom, and there was a dual labor market, and in the secondary market, of course, migrants prevailed. And in Italy as well, there was a sort of family welfare situation, and so migrants and especially carers who came from abroad filled in the gaps that existed in our welfare system. And Italy had many immigrants in the past century, and I'd say up to the 60s. But the feeling, the acceptance of migrants in Italy were totally different. I mean, Italy was practically black in your map. And I don't know whether I can ask you this question, but is there any sort of explanation? Have you tried to find some explanation? Because in my opinion, the initial situation was very similar, but final result totally different. Well, dictatorship was another factor you mentioned.
The only thing I can really see as a big difference is this cultural affinity. Of course, Spanish is a much wider spoken language in the world than Italian. So there are these adjustment costs of people arriving and learning the language. All these Latin Americans spoke Spanish better than us, and that, I think, facilitate matters a lot. We saw them as us rather than they. So I think that's also, I'm not so sure of whether the occupational distribution of migrants in Italy was the same as in Spain. I try to stress that the huge impact on all the household production sector, housekeeping, etc., was very instrumental in this favorable view of migrants. Okay, so, and also I think it was a good thing to have this huge amnesty that because these people were already there, okay? And they could start contributing to Social Security. So it's a mix, it's a blend of different effects. I think the cultural affinity and the language and religion, etc., it's something which may explain these differences between Spain and Italy.
Quindi non è un modello
So it's not a model we can replicate.
The lesson to be drawn here is that you really need to assimilate these people as soon as possible. You really need to invest in the training, in their schools, etc., etc. You cannot lose a single moment. I mean, investment now are key, because the lack of investment will be very long-lasting, will have very unfavorable effects for a long time.
Vai.
Sì, grazie.
Thank you for your explanation. My question is the following. Well, certainly migration can be an advantage for the pension system in the short term, but if we're speaking about the long term, well, that may create some imbalances since a percentage of these migrants might come to Italy or Spain when they are, I don't know, 30 or 40, so they have not paid social contributions. So they might be a deficit for the pension system.
Esatto, raccogliamo tre.
Well, maybe we can collect a few questions and then answer. Well, your presentation was very fascinating. My concern is that in Italy as well, we have many affinities. Well, we don't have language affinities, but the true problem, well, since you live in Italy, I mean, you do live in Italy, but to what extent is this being exploited by some political parties? And our cultural, cognitive, educational impoverishment creates a situation whereby we are mesmerized by persons such as Calderoli. I mean, what you said about Spain seems to say that, I mean, the Spain, I mean, because of your past history, because of the dictatorship, well, portrays a country that is more developed than ours from the cultural viewpoint. I'm afraid that there is a sort of cultural and educational impoverishment of Italy, and some politicians try to exploit all that. What's your opinion? I'm just imagining it all. Or is it sort of reasonable what I think it might be? I mean, the cause behind it all. Another question? Well, first of all, thank you for your lecture. You said that migration in Spain, well, responded to a number of requirements by the Spanish economy, such as the crisis of the pension system, the slowdown in the birth rate, the labor market that is sort of dualized and so on. In your opinion, is immigration the only answer, or is there any other alternative to solve these problems? Then one final question. Well, we need microphones to guarantee translations, yes. Well, the Italian problem, wouldn't you say that the Italian problem is a problem of religious intolerance vis-a-vis all these people who, by culture and religion, are so different from Italians? Possibly Italy, as our chairperson said at the very beginning, possibly the migration phenomena were very similar over the years, very similar to the Spanish ones, and they did not lead to any sort of intolerance, as it is the case now, because in the past we had different migrants. I mean, people who had different religions, whereas today migration in Italy has different features. Sorry, we must go on with the questions.
Let me start with a question about the impact on the pay-as-you-go pension system. Of course, it's a short-term phenomenon. But remember, even though there are bilateral agreements by which pensions are portable, remember, pensions are proportional to your working life, in a sense. So they have some sort of sense of proportionality. So these guys, remember, were arriving at late 20s, early 30s, And they were contributing, and 1 million of them have left, and about 500,000 of them didn't have bilateral agreements with the Spanish government. So they contributed in exchange for no pension to bring with to the countries of origin. So it's a short-term phenomenon. As I told you at the end, it bought 5 years of peace for the pension system in terms of deficit. That's all. Okay? And of course there is a long literature saying what sort of migrants would save. You will need highly skilled migrants, etc., those who contribute most. And you will need the rates return back to the countries of origin at large numbers as well. So it's a short-term impact, but a favorable one for sure. Regarding the difference between Spain and Italy, which were the subject of a couple of questions, I think this difference about the political past in Spain, of course Italy also went through a dictatorship, but earlier than in Spain. But the fact that 40 years of extreme right parties ruling the country were willing to be completely forgotten, I think has helped, because there is some sort of intrinsic relationship between xenophobia and far-right parties. Due to the political transition in Spain, which was very smooth, even the Franco supporters helped to move ahead with an exemplary democratic transition, meant that, as I pointed out before, the extreme right is not existent in Spain, and that may be some explanation of these small differences. At the end of the day, small differences make big differences in outcomes.
Sí,
is immigration the only solution? Of course not. I mean, many of these dysfunctionalities come from old-fashioned or outdated regulations, etc., and of course the first aim, the first goal would be to change these regulations, and that's the way it is. So migrants cannot be a solution, but of course can help to solve some of these rigidities. About religious intolerance, I think we are two countries with more or less share the same religion, although I mean, I come from a country which was one of the first countries, for instance, to approve gay marriage, and I see this is one of the last countries to do so. So I think in that respect, Spain is much more liberal, maybe because the Vatican is here and not in Spain, but that's another issue.
Grazie.